Painting and Travel with Roger and Sarah Bansimer travels to Escanaba, Michigan, where they visit the Sandpoint Lighthouse. Sarah learns of its history, while Roger sets up his easel and uses acrylics to paint the historic structure.
This charming kitchen is inside a lighthouse at Sandpoint in Escanaba, Michigan. We're actually inside the lighthouse, and this is the charming kitchen area. And I want to show you something beautiful. It's a wood carving, a very large one, of a Saint Bernard and 4 puppies. This is hand carved in Switzerland, and you can see the hair on this beautiful Saint Bernard. And it has 4 puppies, and that's the runt. You can identify the runt because they're always the last to eat and usually very demure. Outside, you'll get to see a lovely view of the lighthouse, and you'll see what Roger's going to paint.
I painted lots of lighthouses, and every one of them is different. Some people think they're a bit sentimental, but in my view, they're just beautiful, solid structures, and no 2 of them are alike. Even if the structure itself is similar to another lighthouse, the sky, the background, the trees, and so on really make it a totally different painting. So here we are at Sandpoint Lighthouse. I have these beautiful flowers out in front here. I used a piece of charcoal to block in the lighthouse itself, and I used charcoal because I can easily wipe it out and start over, and that was the case here. I did a fairly accurate drawing, and after I got done with that, I gave it a second look, and I thought the lighthouse was too big, and it just didn't give enough attention to these flowers down here, which I think will make a nice part of the painting. So I wiped it out, and I started it again and drew that a second time. Now it's really important to get an accurate drawing, so I did spend some time doing this. I'll be using a 9 by 12 inch masonite board covered with gesso. My palette consists of acrylics, titanium white, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, Indian yellow, cadmium yellow, alizarin crimson, chromium oxide green, and 3 earth colors: burnt umber, burnt sienna, and yellow ochre. I have quite a few colors out on my palette today, and it's just a personal choice. Sometimes I use a lot, sometimes I don't use many. Now this is basically a 1-point perspective drawing. Not quite though. If it were 1-point perspective, I couldn't see the side of this house. But I'm almost straight on. If I were over another 15 feet or so, it definitely would be a 1-point perspective. This is actually a 2-point perspective, but there is not very much perspective here since I am basically looking at the side of the building. I like to use my transparent colors to start a painting. And these 3 colors here, ultramarine blue, Indian yellow, and alizarin crimson, those are all transparent colors. Sometimes Indian yellows are not transparent, depends on the manufacturer. If I were to use the opaque colors to start with, my painting would look a bit chalky because most opaque colors have white in them, not all of them. But so I want to lay in my darks first, and I generally do that. And I'm not looking for color right now, I'm looking at value. That means the lightness or darkness of something. So I'm just concerned basically with my darks to start with. This is just part of the blocking in process to get things established. Here I've drawn in some of the rocks and some of the areas with the trees. Now I am going to pick up some chromium oxide green. Often I cover my board with a thin coat of burnt sienna or some color to get rid of the white. In this case, I didn't do it today. I could have just as easily, and sometimes that helps to get a good start on a painting. But since these are acrylics, that's not quite dry, but see, just a matter of a few seconds, this is almost dry to the touch. So I can lay a wash of burnt sienna on here if I like this, a thin wash, and I can still see a few of the lines for the drawing through there. And since this is applied thin, this will dry in probably less than a minute. Now, when that's drying, I can move on to something else. This just gives me a nice base to start with under here. Then I can lay my greens and my rocks on top of that. All right, we have a white lighthouse, but it's not white because the sun is not on it right now. It's being lit by the sky, but it's not a pure white. So I want this to be a cool color. And the reason it's going to be a cool color is because the light that is hitting it is from the sky, and that sky is definitely very blue today. So the sky is basically lighting this lighthouse and giving it that blue color. Now, if it were being lit by the sun, it would be a warm tone. Now, I just don't want to mix blue and white, so I'll put some bit of brown in there, burnt umber, to gray it some. Here, I'll try that. Now that may end up being too blue, I don't know. It's hard to tell at this point until I get the rest of the colors on there. I may have to adjust that. Now I did draw some windows in there. I'm going to lose those as I paint, but drawing it with the windows and so on, I just familiarize myself with the subject. Okay, now that looks very blue to me right now. Maybe it's too blue, but when I add the sky, that all might change. I think I'll go up to the lantern room here, take some burnt umber and ultramarine blue. I'll just place in the bottom part of that lantern room, very dark. And I'm not going to paint the top there yet because I'm going to paint the sky first. That may be a little hard to paint around all that. We do have the roof here. Let me add the roof. I'm taking my burnt sienna, yellow ochre. I've got a nice shadow coming across that roof now from the chimney, which I didn't draw in there, but I will. And I'm just laying this in with some big brush work. These are new brushes, fairly new brushes. That means I can get a nice chisel point on them for some nice sharp edges like here. Get that great shadow coming from that chimney there. That's going to change, I'm sure, by the time I'm finished within a half hour or so. It's quite early in the morning now, so the light changes very fast. Oh, I still have some of my colors left here from the building, so I can just put that chimney right in here. Let's go for the sky now. It's early morning. It's a very pale blue sky. I'll use cerulean blue and white. It's a bit warm, so I'll add a touch of yellow ochre to that, especially down here. This will always be warmer down here in this area, and this will be cooler. As you look up towards the top of the sky, it always gets bluer and warmer as we go down here. And I'll lay that in quite thick because I want it to cover. Acrylics don't cover as well as oils, so I want to lay this on quite thick to begin with, just so I don't have to go over it with a second pass. I often have to do that anyway. You see there's some light coming through the lantern room there, so I will make that the same color of the sky and just cut around the lighthouse. There we go. Now I can see already that I may have to change the values of these, because when I placed this sky in here, it seems to be a need for this to be slightly darker, but I'll decide that in a few moments. That's why I say it's always important to get the board covered and not spend any time on detail, at least for me, right at the first part of the painting, because I always find myself having to adjust the colors and the values as I go. These are always sort of snap decisions, and a lot of it is just intuitive. The more you paint, the more you can understand what's going to happen as you apply all these brush strokes, but not always. I often get fooled and think that I'm going to knock off a painting pretty quickly, and I find out that I start to have difficulties somewhere along the way that I just never thought I would have. But I've got a pretty good feeling about this one here. Okay, we'll move down again. I think I'll start with these trees now. This is all totally dry. That's good. That's one advantage of the acrylics. And I'm going to put some greens back here with these trees, but I want my brilliant greens to be in the foreground here. And even though I can't really differentiate between some of the greens back here in these trees and some of the greens in the foreground, what I want to do is make these greens back here slightly paler and slightly cooler. And that will give the impression that I have some distance between me and these trees as opposed to the things in the foreground. So I'm not painting it exactly as I see it. I'm painting it as best I can, so I'll end up with a convincing painting. And sometimes that means changing really what I see and translating that into what I hope will make a better painting. That's really one of the tricky parts about art, I think, is knowing what to put in, what to leave out, how to change things. So this is a good point in the painting because I have everything covered with some kind of color or value and shape. I have left nothing untouched. So now it's sort of the second stage of the painting where I can start to refine what I have here. I'm sitting down kind of low. I'm right by the beach here. The water's lapping up from Lake Michigan. And so I'm very close to the horizon line, which runs right about at the base of the lighthouse because I'm sort of below the lighthouse. We have a beautiful lawn up here, but I can't see much of it because I'm, of course, down low. But I can indicate some of that, and that's catching the sunlight. And we have a lot of these rocks here on the beach. I'm standing in some really powdery sand. It's kind of a brown color. So that brown here might help me some. The rocks are sort of a slate blue, and I lost my drawing on all those rocks. But as I compare the light parts of these rocks with the lighthouse, I can see that these rocks are warmer than the wall of the lighthouse. Even though they're sort of a slate blue, I'm going to make these slightly warmer. I've got a little spray atomizer here. I'll spray that every once in a while to keep those paints wet. This is getting the direct sunlight here, so it does dry them fast. Scrape a bit of this off. That way these, if I want to get some dark colors, they won't mix with any of those light colors there. Okay, let's put in some of the dark greens. The flowers are kind of scattered all over, but when I was sketching this, I did sort of establish a pattern for myself that I thought would help here. So I just don't want to put a bunch of flowers in here, 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 everywhere. I'm trying to put them where they kind of make the composition flow. I have some right in the foreground, so I was going to put some right in here. And what I intend to do, if I can, is keep these large shapes intact. Because if I put too many small shapes in a painting, it gets a little confusing and it just won't hold together as well. So with these flowers and these, all the greenery here, see, I'm trying to create some large shapes. And it's really hard to see that. I have to think about that and really simplify it. It's really easy to get carried away with detail, especially in the first part of a painting, and I don't want to do that. I might just leave it at that. Maybe some lighter greens in here and some earth tones. See how this is getting built up a little at a time. I'm going to leave out a lot of these rocks. Again, just trying to simplify it. It's never a bad thing to leave something out of a painting, but it's often a good way to get in trouble by putting in too much. Let me add these windows in here. There's one right in the middle. I'm not going to put any detail in these windows. And here you can see what a nice job a new brush with a good chisel point on it will do. Makes a nice square edge there. Now later on, if I have time, I can put in some of the window panes and so on. but the big areas first. I'm really tempted to pick up a small brush and start with a detail, but I'm going to continue on with some of the larger shapes for just a moment. And it's important for me to start to build these shapes, refine them, but maintain the large shape. By putting on other values and colors, I don't want to lose that large shape in there. I have a dark tree right back here. It's a beautiful, sort of a very warm red color, and it hides a lot of that window. This is one of the things I could have left out had I chosen to. And if I want, I can always go back and take it out later in the studio if it just doesn't fit the composition or if it just doesn't look like I had hoped. With cerulean blue here on my brush, and I'm putting some shadows over these rocks. All right, now I'll pick up the small pointed brush. So I'm glad I didn't rush putting in any of the details until now. Here's the underside of the lantern room. Right here we have the little band going around the top. With the sky color, I'll put in a few negative areas in amongst these trees and one or two negative areas on this side. Well, I guess I will add that fence because it is part of the lighthouse. I'll use my ruler and hope that I get it in the right place here. Right, you know, I don't want this to stand out a lot. So I think if the paint doesn't cover or if it skips some, I think that might be okay. Might give it a little bit of a painterly feel. Now this stops about there, and then there's a gate, and it starts again. Yeah, that adds a little bit of interest. Trick to this is to load your brush up, put a lot of paint on it, then sort of twirl it at the end to get the brush up to a point. Here's the third rail. That should do it. Okay, I'll put a few posts here on the gate. It's not a gate, it's just a little entrance. This lighthouse is open to the public, and even when it's not open, you can just walk right up here and take a look at it, which is very nice. I think that's just about the right value for this fence. Doesn't show up too much, doesn't distract from the overall painting. I'm going to add some flowers here, and that's why I put out the cadmium yellow light. This is a very opaque color. My Indian yellow is a very warm color, and these flowers are obviously a very cool yellow. I just happen to have my flat again, so it's a fairly large brush, but if I use the edge of it here, I can tap in some of these flowers, and I'm trying to keep in mind this shape again. So I want to bring these flowers around that large shape. I want to be careful not to put in too many flowers. There are a lot of flowers here, but I'm always cautious about putting in too many flowers to get the painting too sentimental or just too pretty. I don't want to overdo it. I don't want these flowers to take over the entire painting. And I think by putting in a few of them and not all of them, it will certainly give the impression of the flowers and not be overwhelmed by too many. A few larger ones right in the front, right in the foreground. And I'll make these bigger, and that will give some perspective to this whole area. With a smaller brush, I'll add some of the light greens where the sun is catching the leaves, lighting up those leaves. Now, I don't have any stems on these flowers, but I'm not sure I really need them. I may just leave them out. It just certainly does give the indication that we have a group of flowers there, and here I don't want to put in a lot of detail that may not be necessary. It could be all right to put those in, but maybe leaving them out will just give a stronger impression of this painting. Right back here, I want the sunlight of this grass to show up in a nice bright sort of way. So I mixed a light green, and right back there is where the sun may be just hitting the top of that grass. And let's do the same over on this side. Just a little sliver of sunlight. There. It's often hard to add all the details that I want to put in a painting here in the field. So I'm going to take a few photographs now of the lighthouse before the light changes any further, and we'll finish it back there.
When you come to Delta County, you must visit the Sandpoint Museum. This is Charles Lindquist, and he's president of the Delta County Historical Society. The lighthouse and the museum behind are just lovely.
Well, thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much.
What is some of the history of this area?
In 1867, this lighthouse was built, and this lighthouse continued in operation until 1939, when the government decommissioned it. The Coast Guard then tore down the tower on this building. They lifted the roof and turned this into kind of a dormitory until the early 1980s. Our Delta County Historical Society said, bring the lighthouse back the way it looked before the Coast Guard turned it into an ordinary-looking dormitory.
You know, I'm so glad that the Historical Society stepped in and did that, because this is one of my favorite lighthouses, and I've been in probably almost 100 at this point.
Oh, gee, thank you.
Which is just the tip of the iceberg, I know, but to be able to have the living quarters right in the lighthouse, and it's so cozy, and it's almost mansion-like because it has so many rooms here.
Mm-hmm. The whole community entered into making this really work, to bring back the lighthouse the way it was. This is a community effort and always has been.
Well, that says a lot about Escanaba, because I think you're a town of only about 13,000.
Yes.
And yet you pulled together, raised the funds, and somehow got everybody on the same page.
Absolutely. We're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, remember. This whole area loves our history. This is an area that a lot of people live here, not just because of the woods and the water, the hunting and the fishing. They love the heritage of this area.
And when I was reading some of the history here, what I found very interesting is there was a woman lighthouse keeper, and she did a great job for
about 20 years.
20 years.
Yes. Her husband had been appointed the first lighthouse keeper in 1866, and he died before he could take over. And his wife, Mary Terry, is a lady who maybe needed a job and could do the job. And she was a lighthouse keeper for about 20 years. And there was a fire one night, and the next morning when they came inside, they found her body in the oil room.
Oh,
she had
goodness.
died in the fire.
And the fire was...
Well, no one ever knew just what...
Was it in this building?
Oh, yeah, it was in this...
So this building burned?
Yes. Oh, this building was burned, not entirely, but they had to bring it back after that situation was passed. And they brought it back the way it had looked again, and then it served as a lighthouse into the 1930s. The next lighthouse keeper was a man called Rose. And he had a family, and he was able to put this home to use. You know, we have several bedrooms upstairs, as you know, and children were not a burden. There was lots of work for those kids to do, starting with sanding the floors and the stairs, I think. They did some pretty serious hard work. And since this was a lighthouse that was in or near a community where, you know, it was just on the edge of Escanaba, kids could go to school here. You know, it's not like so many lighthouses which are so isolated. Mm-hmm. This one was right on the edge of Escanaba, and so they could be part of the community.
I've noticed there's a large museum behind me.
Yes.
And the Historical Society created that?
Yes, we've had a museum here since the 1950s, and we were able to take the museum and archives we had and turn it into something really very nice now.
Well, this is such a friendly place to visit, and it's very easy to get to this lighthouse. Even the parking is easy, and it's so pleasant to walk around. You don't really have it locked off at night, because we came up last evening, and we were walking around, and that's when we fell in love with it. And,
yes.
Charles, thanks for sharing some of the history with me of this lighthouse. It's really quite extraordinary to learn, particularly about Mary Terry, who was a lighthouse keeper for 20 years,
yes.
and then a great part of the community.
Yes.
And then mysteriously died in the fire.
It's been my pleasure to have you here, and I hope you can come back.
Love to.
Well, here we are in the studio, and it didn't take much to put a few finishing touches on this painting. Since I was using acrylics, which don't always cover as well as oils, I went over the sky again to eliminate those areas where the paint wasn't covering as well as I thought it needed to be. Then with yellow ochre mixed with the sky color of cerulean blue, I warmed the area nearer the horizon. To push the trees in the background more, I applied a wash of green mixed with a bit of white to soften them, which would also make the foreground colors look more brilliant. Basically, to finish the painting was really nothing more than just adding a few details that are often difficult to simplify when in front of the real thing. Here, a warm tone was placed on the rocks where the sunlight was hitting them, and then a darker tone I added for more texture, representing smaller rocks on the beach. With a small brush, the railing was added to the lantern room, and using a ruler as a guide for my hand, I struck a line with my brush along the roof of the eave of the house. Next, a dark area was placed toward the bottom of the window and a shadow right under the eaves. Again, with a small brush, the window frames were carefully but loosely painted, and then a subtle highlight along the top of the fence. To finish the painting, I added just a few more flowers in the foreground with a brighter yellow. Sarah and I enjoyed visiting this area and the Sandpoint Lighthouse, and with its surroundings of rocks, foliage, and such, had a lot of nice elements to it, yet it didn't seem too difficult a subject, which is always something to look for when painting.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansimer, visit paintingandtravel.com.